Hello, welcome everyone to the first Humanities Forum of the season. I'm just so happy to be here with all of you. I wish we could be in person, but since we can't, I'm just delighted that our online format gives us an opportunity to meet interesting people and to be even more accessible to an even bigger audience. We have a really terrific fall Humanities Forum series pulled together for you. Please take a look at the schedule. It's on our website at dreschercenter.umbc.edu. Before we begin, I just want to make some acknowledgements. First, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established on the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. I want to thank the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association and the School of Public Policy for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture. And finally, I want to thank Vital Signs LLC for helping us to make this event even more accessible with real-time captioning. This talk tonight will be recorded and made available on the Drescher Center's YouTube page, and you can also connect with us on social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I want to make sure to invite you to attend the next Humanities Forum event, which is coming up next week on Thursday, October 7th at 4 p.m. The Department of Ancient Studies will be presenting Cleopatra, the most famous woman of classical antiquity, a talk by Dwayne Roller, who's a professor emeritus of classics at Ohio State University. Focusing solely on primary sources, Dwayne Roller will discuss the life of the most famous woman from classical antiquity, Cleopatra, whose reputation is based largely on her presentation in literature, art, and cinema. That event will be held in the Alban O'Kuhn Library Gallery on the UMBC campus with limited in-person capacity, so advanced registration is required. Please contact Emily Hubbard, who is ehubbard@umbc.edu. The lecture will also be live streamed via WebEx, and you can go to dreschercenter.umbc.edu for more details. So finally, for our main event, to help us kick off, I'd like to introduce Tanya Munoz, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communication.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for being here. My name is Tania Munoz, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communication, where I teach Spanish, Latin American, and Latinx literature courses. I'm also a new board member of the executive committee of the Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association at UMBC, one of the sponsors of this event. I'm here on behalf of our current president, Dr. Maria Sanchez, a professor of the practice at the Department of Mechanical Engineering. As our board starts a new term this academic year, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our former board members for all their work during the past year, especially. And in particular, I want to thank Dr. Ana Maria Schwartz Caballero, our previous president and the co-founder of the association. As many of you know, Dr. Ana Maria recently retired, but this event was always one of her favorites. And I know she is very happy we were able to make this talk happen this year, as we've been trying to get Yarimar Bonilla to come for a few years now. Ana Maria, we're thinking of you and you're missed. The Latinx and Hispanic Faculty Association is very happy to be co-sponsoring this event as part of the Latinx Heritage Month, which ends on October 15th. So we still have plenty of time. And as our communities are still the target of harmful policies in our current political climate, I invite all of you here to celebrate the stories and the histories of our communities, but also to celebrate them this month and every month. At the same time, during this month and every month, it's also important to have relevant conversations about issues going on in our communities. And with this in mind, I want to introduce Dr. Yarimar and Fernando Torres-Aponte, who will be leading today's conversation. Dr. Yarimar Bonilla is a director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. She's also a professor in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College, and in the PhD program in Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Dr. Bonilla is a prominent public intellectual and a leading voice on Caribbean and Latinx politics. She writes a monthly column in the Puerto Rican newspaper El Nuevo Día titled En Vaivén, which is a regular contributor to publications such as the Washington Post, The Nation, The New Yorker, and a frequent guest on national public radio and news programs such as Democracy Now! My colleague, who will be also leading this conversation today, Dr. Fernando Tormos-Aponte, is an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at UMBC, a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University, and a Kendall Fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists Center for Science and Democracy. He earned his MA and PhD in political science from Purdue University and a BA from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. Dr. Tormos-Aponte specializes in social movements, identity politics, social policy, and transnational politics, and his research focuses on how social movements cope with internal divisions and gain political influence. His work has appeared in many scholarly publications, edited volumes, and news outlets. I want to thank you both for being here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, Dr. Fernando.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and to all the organizers for this opportunity, for this space to discuss something that is definitely very near to our hearts with, frankly, one of the scholars that I admire the most, and definitely someone who has garnered international recognition for her important work in Caribbean studies and particularly Puerto Rico. So Yarimar, I want to extend you a warm welcome, even virtually, to UMBC, where we're super excited to host you.
Hola, I'm so happy to be here and to be in conversation with you, Fernando. It's a mutual admiration fest on this WebEx. So
I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. Yarimar, I should start by saying that we have no agenda. But I want to start with something that is really at the top of our minds. Those of us who are aware of what's happening in Puerto Rico right now have been witnessing that there are widespread power outages, and this has been a common feature for quite some time now. And I just want to get your quick reaction to this. Like, what is happening? What is happening in Puerto Rico right now?
Well, I just got back from Puerto Rico. Spent a week there chasing this story precisely for our newest episode of Puerto Rican Voices, the TV show that we produce at Centro, which is now moving into a more kind of investigative journalism format. And you know, the way that we're approaching the story is, to me, is that this is the latest aftershock, you know, the latest crisis in Puerto Rico. So as you and I have talked, you know, I think about what has been happening in Puerto Rico as a series of cumulative disasters and crises layered one on top of the other, in a way that, you know, each of them kind of intertwines and you know, keeps unfolding. And so for the broader public, it began with Maria, but for Puerto Ricans, it began before Maria, with the economic crisis and with our, you know, the colonial history. And so after Maria, we had the earthquakes and we had the pandemic, and now we have this energy crisis that is, you know, for everyone, it's deeply tied to Maria and to our previous disasters, because, you know, part of what is provoking it is the financial crisis, the lack of maintenance to the energy grid, but also the kind of disaster profiteering that was possible after Maria, where the electric company was broken into parts and sold. I would like to say to the highest bidder, but it was actually to the only bidder, a company that was created to buy Puerto Rico's energy grid that did not exist prior to it, that came in with what is legally described as a leonine contract, a legal term that I did not know until this moment. In Puerto Rico, I keep hearing over and over again, contrato leonino, and I thought they were comparing it to a lion, but it's a legal term that means that it is a contract that is, you know, one-sided for which there's a one-sided beneficiary. And so that legal term, you know, that legal condition of this immoral contract means that this should be annulled, this contract, but instead the government is, moving forward, and the result has been daily, not even daily, like multiple times a day, blackouts in Puerto Rico that get blamed on everything, from a bird,
A cat,
a thunderstorm, a cat, and now seaweed is the latest culprit that gets blamed for these power outages. And yesterday I had a Zoom call with some, collaborators in Puerto Rico, and everyone was in their cars because that's where they could go to like charge up their batteries and, maybe turn on the air conditioner for a little while. So it's really just, just a total state of emergency right now with the electric grid. And we interviewed, today there is a protest at the University of Mayagüez where students are saying that recess, a kind of needs to be declared, that they can't go to school in the middle of this energy crisis, where and it's important to remember, a lot of the folks that I interviewed, they want to really insist upon that we're not talking about energy to power cable TV or play Nintendo. In many cases, we're talking about life-saving energy that is powering refrigerators, CPAP machines, keeping medications cold, and also keeping the elderly and the disabled comfortable, right? So it's a really a humanitarian crisis, is what we're really dealing with. And then the other part is that, a lot of people are being pushed because of this to turn to solar energy. And that might sound really wonderful, but not everyone can afford that. And so it's a kind of privatized resilience where some people are able to get off the grid and to not suffer through the indignities of the constant power outages. But that just makes it worse for those who have no option but to be on the grid. So it's really a dire situation, and I think it's leading to massive protests. I mean, there's just that's clearly coming around the pike. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's so interesting how like we see all these disasters tied to major bouts of protests, and we'll get there. We'll get to 2019. But just to put these outages in a little bit of context, what's interesting too is, as you said, these are not sort of vain desires of having luxuries at home, but rather outages we know are definitely to blame for a lot of preventable deaths. And this happens in disaster context as well as just general outages that are happening over and over again in Puerto Rico. So I like this notion that you just introduced, this privatized resilience. And I like it because I was feeling a lot like this when the pandemic just started, where I feel like the logic that dominated the ways with which people were expected to survive this pandemic were very individualist. It was I called it sort of the neoliberal approach to disaster management. It was everybody get their own things, everybody go to their stores. We ran out of everything, including things we probably didn't even need in excess, such as toilet paper, among other other supplies. But it was this very individualist notion of resilience, although there are tendencies that were really emphasizing the importance of collective and mutual support. And you witnessed some of these in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and we've had a lot of colleagues who've written about mutual support. What do you find interesting about these like collective experiments of like self-governance, of collective well-being and solidarity?
Yes, well, now my student, Sarah Molinari, she writes about infrastructures of care that have emerged in Puerto Rico because, it's not just about electricity and water and food, although it is about that, but it's also about caring for each other and how to come together in the face of absolute state abandonment. And in Puerto Rico, we have the local state and the imperial state, abandoning us doubly. And so I think that, these kinds of community responses are so important precisely when the state is pushing us towards an individual response, and we see it with the pandemic also, a part of the failure of the vaccination campaign in the US has been that it's been promoted as an individual response. So you wear your mask, you vaccinate yourself, you choose if you want to do that or not. There's not a real sense of, you know, the vaccine only works if we're collectively vaccinated, etc. And you're not, it's not just a choice that you're making for yourself, but also for those around you. And so similarly, the way that people are dealing with the disaster in Puerto Rico is you buy it used to be you buy planta, a generator, right? Or you buy solar panels, or you buy a ticket out of Puerto Rico, you know, because that's the other thing that's really important to keep in mind, how all of this is connected to displacement, you know, and so while the state is recruiting wealthy folks to come with tax incentives, who can buy the solar panels and who can live off the grid, and who are fine with that because they're not paying taxes. So when you're not paying taxes, you don't care so much about public services, or you're able to endure without those public services. And in fact, you know, you're the kind of person who doesn't want a big state, you know, if you don't want to pay taxes into that state, right? But for those who are left behind, unable to migrate, a lot of elderly populations, folks who can't afford solar panels, and also folks who live in condominiums, which I think there's not been enough discussion of, you know, even wealthy people who live in condominiums can't get off the grid, can't get generators, you know, so there are certain solutions that just have to be collective, you know, that just can't be farmed out to individuals. One interesting thing that's happening in Puerto Rico, though, is that the unit, what the social unit is, I feel is under question. And what the role of the state is under question. And so I've been really interested in the way that local mayors are responding to the multiple crises, how they're creating consortiums. And so you have community organizations, but you also have this rise of what I call municipionalismo, where you know, municipalities have become important in a different way, and I think that's going to really bring into question the role of the state in Puerto Rico, and it might kind of create new possibilities for thinking about political status, because I think a lot of people are thinking that the state has to be disinvested from, you know, taking its authority away, and that we have to empower more a smaller scale government, and that this is what is necessarily, and this became important after Maria, where both the federal state and the local state was absent. It was really the mayors that had to respond to their constituencies, and they were completely cut off. They didn't even have phone lines to talk to the central government. So this kind of decentralization, I think, is interesting and is something that we need to think critically about as an alternative to privatization. Because I think a lot of people, when they talk about the problems with the electric grid and they make arguments in favor of privatization, I think what they're really opposed to is the intense bureaucracy that comes through centralization. But that doesn't mean that services like electricity and water should not, you know, should be commodities. They should not be commodities. They should be public services. But maybe we need to rethink the units that distribute and create those services.
A lot to unpack here. I mean, just to begin with, this notion of municipalismo, fascinating. You know, after Maria in 2017, there was a lot of concern with respect to whether the power authority was giving preferential treatment to its own employees, particularly its supervisors. So the Legislative Commission of the Issues of the West convened a hearing where they investigated. And one of the things that I found really interesting as I was reading through the transcript of this of the different testimonies was that the Mayagüez, which is a West Coast municipality, the Mayagüez local emergency manager, the municipal level emergency manager, had very specific information about where each individual in the entire municipality that had any sort of need for electricity, for life-saving need for electricity, was located. and they were able to communicate that with the power authority. So it makes sense that there's this shift towards on over reliance now on mayors, in part because they're really tied to the community. They have more knowledge of what those needs are that seem to have been absent across other scales of government, and particularly the federal and state or Puerto Rico government level of government. So on the other hand, I remember speaking with some folks that had an urban farm. Well, it wasn't, I guess it's debatable whether it's urban or not, but they had a farm in Dorado. That's a whole different debate. What is urban? What isn't urban? Interestingly, the census considers most of Puerto Rico urban, although if you go through it, you'd realize that really isn't. But anyways, they
Well,
were in
and
Dorado.
even in the center of San Juan and Santurce, you see chickens and pigs rolling around. So, like, what is urban? Yeah.
Exactly, right. And you have conditions that you would normally associate with rural locations. So this group was saying how they would put together these events for the community, and all of us, and they would do these things that the mayor wasn't doing. And all of a sudden, when the mayor would notice that they were doing them, the next day, whatever they were trying to do, the mayor would do. And there's all these electoral incentives for doing things in Puerto Rico. And I certainly identified that with respect to the power restoration in Hurricane Maria, a highly politicized agency like the Power Authority in Puerto Rico that directed the whole outage recovery certainly had a lot of the folks that were appointed by the same party that is now saying that it was inefficient, that it was unable to manage this energy grid, and therefore privatization was necessary. Do you get the sense that the public power authority in Puerto Rico was purposefully sort of sabotaged to make way for this justification of privatization? And does this kind of discourse resonate with you of neoliberalism? This notion of that we need to privatize always fails forward, even if they fail to deliver. Right now, the reaction that we see from politicians, instead of saying that this contract doesn't work, that privatizing this energy utility was a terrible idea, as it was to privatize water, their reaction is no, we just need to dig deeper. Is that we haven't privatized the whole thing. We haven't privatized generation. That's the problem. Do you find these things compelling?
Yes. So lots of to unpack there. So first of all, I think there was a clear, you asked me if I thought there was sabotage. I think there was a clear disinvestment in the electric company. And it reminds me of how in inner city neighborhoods, developers will leave empty lots, etc., to kind of wait out and drive out population and then develop, right? So similarly, there was a neglect of maintenance, and it was kind of, this was allowed to break down to, there was no repairs, there was no modernization, etc., almost to kind of make it, the least valuable thing that we could sell. It's so crazy. Something that should be the most valuable thing that we could sell. A monopoly on an essential service. How could there only be one company interested in this, right? So that happened. But there was also the politicization of it, which is, I think, is distinct from the neglect, and disinvestment. And the politicization of it was not dealt with, and instead was used as an excuse to disinvest from it, right? And so the politicization of it was that there were a lot of political appointees, friends and family of high-powered politicians that was
big salaries,
some jobs. Yeah, but I think it's important to, having spent a week talking to a lot of electricity workers, it's important to say that this was not all that the electric company was, and that there were a lot of people, engineers, people who trained their whole lives to give this service, and under the most dire conditions. Electric workers in Puerto Rico, I learned last week, were among the few in the nation that work on live power lines, and they take greater risks. They were taking greater risks than electric workers in the 50 states. And when I visited the UTIER Center for the Union for Electric Workers, I was struck that there was this wall of pictures with a title above that said "Mártires del Trabajo." You know, people who had been martyrs to the electric grid. I'm like, I don't think people should be martyrs to work. You know, that kind of struck me. But and a lot of the folks that I interviewed who, when the company is privatized, they just immediately lose their jobs. And they, you know, they're told that they can apply for new jobs with Luma, but under conditions that would invalidate, you know, their decades of service and all, you know, everything they had accumulated up until then, you know, and that also made them feel as if they were worthless, you know, and even while a lot of the political appointees at the upper levels did keep their jobs and did stay on with Luma. So like the politicization of it, which was the real problem, where people who didn't have the expertise, didn't have the years of service, were certainly not martyrs to the electric grid, they were not weeded out, you know? And so there's, I think that's an issue too. And then there's the question you asked about privatization always being looked at as this cure, even as it fails to cure anything, right? And I think that insistence that the kind of free market will yield better service, you know, it you know, it comes up again and again. But when you have a monopoly, what kind of free market is there, right? And also, is a public good, should a public good be on the free market? Because what we want for a public good is not necessarily for it to be the most profitable. Which is what free market is good at. Free market is good at profit, you know? And so if we wanted the electric company to be the most profitable, then yeah, maybe it shouldn't be in the hands of the government. But that's not what we want or need. You know, we need an electric company that can take a hit on profit when the abuelita needs to put on her CPAP machine, you know? And so this is not an area in which this debate should be had. But on top of it, we're not talking about free market, we're talking about monopoly, right? But I think that all gets tied into also the colonial, you know, context in which, you know, Puerto Ricans have been told that they can't govern themselves, that they can't run their own power companies, that they're the most corrupt in the world, etc. Even though the folks who are benefiting from this contract, you know, all the funds are flowing out of Puerto Rico, you know, not all, but, you know, a good amount. And so, and that this, you know, this whole deal stinks of corruption, incredibly so. And those arrows point to the US and Canada, which are, you know, where the kind of parent companies for this new Luma company reside. I don't know if I hit everything that you touched, because you put a lot on the table.
No, I think you did. And, you know, as you know, I've been very invested in this topic, and it's fascinating that things that have been done to sort of weaken the union of power line workers, which was such an important and strong union. And I think it's, to me, no coincidence that they were go after this union, because they held a lot of power, given that they were often standing in solidarity with other struggles like the student movement, another case where you don't necessarily want to have a profitable sort of entity in higher education. And UTIER, this power line worker union, was extremely, extremely powerful in Puerto Rico. One of the ways in which they try to curtail the power of UTIER after Hurricane Maria was that every contractor that they would bring from outside to work the power grid, they would never let them be surrounded by any unionized power line worker. They would always separate them, no matter whether that led to inefficiencies with respect to the recovery. They did not want the unionized workers to put in the mind of the non-unionized workers the idea of, you know, the benefits of being in a union. I always found that to be fascinating.
Well, you know what's so crazy? I don't want to reveal a little punchline of the documentary, but I guess I'm going to, is that a lot of they wanted to crush this union, right? And so by getting everyone out of the union, and now the union can no longer represent them if they're working for Luma. But a huge number of the employees, the majority, chose not to go to work for Luma, and they've been scattered across all these different public agencies in Puerto Rico. So now you've taken the most unionized, the most like labor conscious employees, and you've scattered them into a bunch of agencies where there was not necessarily a strong union presence. And so it might be that they're planting little seeds. Who knows? This might be a huge backfire.
That is fascinating. And it takes me to another point, something that I'm really excited to discuss with you because I know you've been thinking about this for a long time. Even though power is out in Puerto Rico, it does not seem to me, at least, that Puerto Ricans are powerless. And you have been identifying sort of these seeds growing in different parts of the archipelago. Where do you see that power growing and nurturing and blooming?
Yes. Well, you know, I try to not be too romantic about it, you know, but it's, you know, we have to find a middle ground to also not reproduce this victim mentality, you know, as if Puerto Rico, you know, which after Maria especially, I feel like before I would tell people I was from Puerto Rico, they didn't really have a lot of reaction because they didn't really know anything about Puerto Rico. And now it's like, oh, are you okay? You have power, you know? And so we've been represented to the world as these like kind of victims sitting in the dark, you know, under a blue tarps, etc. But the fact is, you Puerto Ricans are not sitting around, you know, and the ways that I see power is how, but it's almost dangerous because I feel like Puerto Ricans have become so resilient. You know, I interviewed folks in Utuado, in the center of the mountains in Puerto Rico. They, you know, they have their solar panels. They're trying to get the Termoeléctrica up and running. They have an organization to pave their roads because after Maria, you know, the government never paved the roads, never fixed, you know, from all the mudslides, all the broken bridges. They have, you know, they're working on the water, they're working on everything. I'm like, what is the role of the state? And you know, that might sound great and wonderful, but people are paying in Puerto Rico the highest sales tax of anywhere in the U.S. And we haven't even begun to pay down the debt, you know, and that's another issue that is, you know, I think not getting enough attention is that right now the Fiscal Oversight Board, they are negotiating the repayment of the debt in terms that Puerto Ricans are not going to be able to pay. And doing things like selling the electricity company to a private company that has already raised the rates and is going to continue raising them. And it's going to basically sink people into poverty, you know? And so even as they are building their roads, coming together, communities, all of that can seem really romantic, but we have to remember that at the same time, they're paying all these taxes and they're going to have to repay this huge debt. And so while the state continues to capture, you know, payments from them, those payments are not turning into services. They're going to debtors. So that, to me, that even though there's a lot of power there, we have to think about how to channel that power into a contestation of the state and of those debt, of that debt restructuring.
A debt that is highly questionable, that has not been audited, even though there have been many demands from the ground for a debt audit. They've been sort of kicking that just down the road and hoping or expecting, or at least saying that this whole restructuring process, debt restructuring process, would lead to some kind of audit. What you mentioned here about sort of this danger of kind of becoming over resilient is really interesting. And I think it's something that I identified on the ground. There's a huge debate, it seems like, within the left in Puerto Rico, where you have some folks arguing that we're doing too much in terms of becoming too resilient, of mutual support, mutual aid, and in the process we're sort of neglecting the role that the left should play in terms of pushing the state to meet its responsibility over the people that it's supposed to represent. And on the other hand, you had folks like Giovanni Roberto, activist who I know you followed in terms of his work, who said, well, actually, you know, these two things aren't mutually exclusive. Like, we can build mutual aid projects that meet immediate needs, all the while building these sustained struggles that push the state to meet its responsibilities. It seems to me like this is an ongoing debate in various organizations. I identified that in La Colectiva Feminista, which in Construcción, a local Black feminist collective in Puerto Rico, which in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria had a mutual aid project in Rio Piedras in San Juan, and they eventually dissolved it because they decided that their role was going to push for that sort of pushing the state, and it was going to be surrounding the state. So it seems to be like a debate that is kind of recurring throughout the left, and then it's definitely, I guess, shaping what people decide to spend their energies on.
So Giovanni, who I have so much appreciation for, I interviewed him for the film that accompanies the book Aftershocks of Disaster, and in the film, he he makes a distinction between mutual aid and kind of first response solidarity work, and he says these are really different things, and he also sees a danger in constantly kind of filling those state gaps. And at the time that I interviewed him, he was talking about people going to help folks after the earthquakes, but then it became the pandemic, so filling those gaps don't allow you to do the kind of work that mutual aid for him represents, which is something that is planned out, that has a vision, that has a kind of component of reimagining your society, of feeling empowered, reimagining, and I think that the first response kind of work can be really important, but what I hear him saying is that we can't confuse the two, right? And that and again, that we can't over romanticize that, and that we also have to find limits to what we can do. There are certain things that should be done at a kind of collective level. For example, the repairing of schools, like schools after the earthquakes, they suffered a lot of damage. Most schools in Puerto Rico suffered structural damage that was just not repaired, and so the kind of the state keeps retreating and retrenching, and so they don't give you electricity, they don't give you water, they don't pave the roads, they don't fix the street lights, they don't reopen the schools, they didn't open also the school cafeterias during the pandemic, which is something that they were supposed to do. And so at what point, when does it stop? What else do we have to do for ourselves? And I think that accepting that is also kind of a form of abuse, of collective abuse that we are accepting, and so we have to demand more. And I think that was part of what was sparked in the 2019 protest. The slogan was "We are more." It was unclear more than what, but I think it was more than them, right? Like more than the ones in power. And we're not afraid. And the not afraid part was, we're more, we're not afraid. Somos más y no tenemos miedo. And I think it was, we're more collectively than we are individually also, and we're not afraid of coming together. Because there's been a long history of repression of political movements in Puerto Rico, and fear of being labeled communist, and then being treated as being too close to Cuba, and all that stuff. And we're also not afraid of demanding what we deserve. I think that was part of what folks were expressing in that moment. And I mean, I'm waiting. This Friday is there's going to be protests in Puerto Rico. There's already massive protests being convened for next week. I'm getting text messages from my family. My mom sent me a picture of her feet up in a hammock. She's like, I'm sitting here with no power, getting ready for the protest. People they just are tired, and the power outages have just been, they've just been so overt. They've impacted everyone, and the kind of incapacity of the state and its insistence on defending the decisions that they've made has just pushed past the breaking point, I think.
Absolutely. And just to continue on this thread of like solidarity networks, one thing that I found really fascinating is that it seemed to me like in the wake of Hurricane Maria, the sort of charity networks that had emerged to provide first aid became really politicized in 2019, and there seemed to have been like a really like guiding thread connecting Hurricane Maria and the disaster in 2017 and the kind of uprising that we witnessed in 2019. I remember an interview in the main Expreso Las Maria, La Americas, the main highway, where a reporter asked one of the attendees, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Well, when the governor in his chat that was revealed that sparked some of these protests, and when I heard that they were looking for some for the dead to feed the vultures, I couldn't take the pain. I had lost someone, and that's why I'm here." Do you see that sort of guiding thread? Like, it seems like the disasters are pushing the population into a kind of political participation that we hadn't seen maybe since Vieques. And so how do you see that? What do you find impressive about, this uprising and the kind of participation that we're seeing now, all the while we're seeing diminished voting, right? Of something that used to be sort of a carnival, as some of our political scientist colleagues in Puerto Rico have called it.
Diminished voting, but hopefully a move away from the traditional political parties. I think the last election, the the candidate who won with the least percentage for governor, the least percentage ever. So we're moving away from a two-party system to a real kind of plurality, which is meant, I always want to remind people, it has meant the rise of left-leaning parties, but also right-leaning parties. And so we have Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, which is progressive. Not everyone is for independence, but everyone is for decolonization and for questioning the current status options, and roots in the Partido del Pueblo Trabajador, which was a workers' party. And so you have that emergence, that they had a lot of votes and won some legislative seats. And then you had Partido Dignidad, which is a religious party that has caused a lot of controversy, since they also got a few seats in the legislation, and they represent a real, constituency in Puerto Rico that is conservative. But I welcome them into the fray, because I think we need to end the monopoly of the two traditional parties, and particularly the Statehood party has long depended on the conservative vote. And I think that having competition is going to push them, we'll see, in new directions. I think maybe, and also I think more and more people, I've long said that the Statehood people, they needed options, because a lot of pro-Statehood people, since there was only one political party that advocated for Statehood, they felt they couldn't vote for anyone else. And so having competition for that vote, because really your idea of governance, whether you think we should be a state or not, that shouldn't be tied to other decisions about how life should be lived in Puerto Rico. And so to disentangle those, I think, is healthy, and to also move the status debate out of the kind of elections for gubernatorial seat and into a decolonization process and debate, which hopefully with some of the measures before the U.S. Congress this coming term, maybe we'll see some traction in that area. But so I do, a lot of people said that the 2019 movement was apolitical or not political. I'm like, what are you talking about? How is a political movement not political? Like, obviously it's political. It's just not in a bi-party mode, and I think that people that, a lot of people who were there, they're like, I'm here because it's not political. But what they meant was that this isn't about the political parties, because people, I think, overall are really disenchanted with the political parties as they've existed for decades in Puerto Rico. So for me, that's a sign of hope, though, that different kind of voter turnout. And if we could get, what is it, la segunda ronda, with the two-tier voting, I think that would be a revolution in Puerto Rico, an electoral revolution in Puerto Rico. So I'm hopeful there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the appetite for electoral reform. It does not seem like there currently is any appetite in the legislature for electoral reform. And then from what I've observed, it's been discussed mostly in intellectual circles. Let me ask you this. Somehow, even after the 2019 uprising, the New Progressive Party, which was at the center of the controversies that led to the 2019 uprising, and for those of you who don't know, the New Progressive Party is a pro-statehood party that held a monopoly over these voters. They somehow managed to keep the governorship. I tend to think that they just have a really good organizational infrastructure. Like they can canvass more than any other party in Puerto Rico. And with the pandemic, they were able to gain a lot of votes with early votes. They had in Puerto Rico, they had to go and pick these votes up in each household. It wasn't like you could leave it in some mailbox. So this required organizational strength. But in your work, you've said it's not just sort of the organizational strength. What is it so alluring about the idea of statehood amongst Puerto Ricans, right? And we know that's different from what folks in the United States want statehood for, right? Like they're salivating over more senators, Democratic senators, or so they presume they would be Democratic. But why do Puerto Ricans want statehood? What have you found in your own ethnographic work around this?
Well, this is a project that I was working on before Maria, and I've not been able to get back to it. But I wanted to write an ethnography of the statehood movement, and one of the things that I found, and the reason I set down on that path was that after certain plebiscite votes, I was invited to be on NPR and on different platforms talking about the statehood movement. And I realized I don't know what motivates people to want to be a state. And so as a good nerd, I'm like, I must write a book about that. So I went and did a lot of interviews. And one thing that surprised me was that I found that so many of the statehood folks that I interviewed, to me, they had a kind of decolonial rage, similar to that of pro-independence folks. But so for many of them, what really angers them is the colonial situation, and so they don't want to be a colony, they don't want to be second-class citizens. But when I talk to them about sovereignty and independence, they see that as romantic, they see that as implausible, partly because we've always been told, that to be independent is to be like Haiti and to be poor and that we're too small, that we don't have enough of an economy. And we're never, we're always told, that compared to these impoverished countries, we're never told that, we could have an economy like Barbados. Barbados is a great economy, So I think that, that is part of it, this fear of being too small, of not being able to be independent. Also a fear of our own government, of the kind of clientelism that has dominated the government, the corruption that dominates the government, as it does in lots of other places as well. And so there's a sense that being tied to the U.S. will provide some kind of checks and balances. And I think also, we've always been led to feel like we're this kind of welfare island, that we benefit from the colonial relationship more than we offer. And that has been debated by a lot of economists who say that more money flows out of Puerto Rico than flows in. But we've been told that we are dependent, and when a president comes, throws paper towels at us and tells us that we are a weight on the U.S. budget, that like reinforces that feeling. And with the debt crisis, even more so. A lot of the folks that I interviewed, nobody, especially those interviews were in 2016, right when the debt crisis was exploding. Nobody talked about how the debt crisis was produced by Wall Street bankers. People talked about kind of Puerto Ricans. They used a lot of family metaphors, as if Puerto Ricans were these teenagers that had crashed the car and had to get their keys taken away or their credit cards cut up. There was no sense of how we had been exploited and dispossessed and into this debt crisis, right? So I think, and that's the other thing about the statehood movement, is that even though a lot of people in there are anti-colonial, the statehood movement itself is not a political movement in the kind of Freudian sense of helping people develop greater consciousness about what it means to be a colony. It doesn't really politicize people by giving them history and kind of contextual understanding of the colonial relationship. Instead, it's focused on that party machine of being elected. That's what it's a political party, not a social movement. And so a lot of the folks that I interviewed, they had no real context about what drives Puerto Rico, what the U.S. gets out of its colonies, which is something that's also true. I mean, in the mainland U.S., in the 50 states, people also don't know, why does the U.S. have colonies? There's been of late, there's a kind of new understandings about U.S. empire. There's a great book, How to Hide an Empire, etc., that has written, scholars have been focusing on the nature of the U.S. as an empire that conceals itself. So as opposed to like the British Empire that always celebrated, that the sun never sets on, on its territories, or the French Empire that felt that it was radiating, its knowledge and culture across the world. The U.S. has always kind of tried to hide its imperial nature, which has helped people not know it and not understand what its benefits are. And so this is part of what I hope to push for through our efforts at Centro contributing to decolonization, is to push the U.S. government to speak more clearly about the benefits it gets from its territorial relationship to Puerto Rico, because the U.S. government is the one that constantly wants the territorial option on the ballot. They don't want to take that out, and so clearly this is the relationship that benefits the U.S., but it masquerades it as one of colonial benevolence and as if we're dependent, right? And so we need to be more clear about what we're, how we're being exploited, and not just how we're supposedly dependent.
Absolutely. Fascinating. And I hope that this book comes out soon, because it seems to me that it's very informative of a not well enough understood current of politics in Puerto Rico that is nevertheless garnering a lot of interest. I want to invite our attendees, in the little time that we have, to put any questions that they might have for Yarimar in the chat. And while they're doing that, I want to ask you one last question. In your work, you've thought about the importance of futures and I know that anthropologists have generally been really interested in the importance of political imagination. Could you tell us why is imagination so important?
I love that question. So part of my book about Guadeloupe, my first book, I write about this big labor movement in Guadeloupe, and it was the biggest strike in French history, and they achieved all these things, but then at the end, people felt like it was a failure because it hadn't it wasn't a revolution where they took over the state and all these things. But I argued that one of the biggest gains of that movement was that it changed what people could dream about, it changed what could be imaginable. So I think similarly, if for Puerto Ricans, we used to have this reference point of how we had this big uprising around getting the U.S. Navy out of Vieques. And so we kept thinking, if we could only ever come together like that again, but when will that happen? And so now after Ricky Renuncia, a lot of people feel like that 2019 uprising, it didn't lead to anything, but it transformed the imagination. It transformed what we think we're capable of and what like our benchmark is of a successful protest, So that alone, like moving the benchmark, reimagining what can be done, which is something that only happens as you're doing it. My mentor was Michel Roth-Trujillo, who wrote, Silencing the Past, famous book about the Haitian Revolution. And he talked about how in the Haitian Revolution, like action, was what drove what they could imagine. The Haitian Revolution started by folks demanding less use of the whip and more, like a couple of more free days to go to market. And suddenly it's in the process of being involved in that uprising that the demands grew and became imaginable, So this idea of what can be imagined, I think is really interesting, and part of what fascinates me, like what are the limits of our imagination and how can we push those limits? I always say that anthropologists, we study that, what we basically argue is that there are other ways of being in the world, and so how to think beyond, the imagined constraints that we have on our world. And so, among the many crises in Puerto Rico, water, energy, climate change, whatever, there's long been a crisis of the imagination, where we have felt kind of stuck in this relationship with the United States that doesn't fully, fit what we want Puerto Rico to be, where we're stuck in an impasse with what we feel are corrupt politicians and overpaying taxes and this unpayable debt, and we can't imagine how to get out of it. So fueling that imagination is just as important as finding renewable energy sources, And so I think that the movements that we've experienced and the ones that I hope we will continue to experience are going to be central to that. And part of what gave me a lot of hope in the 2019 movement, and what I've been thinking about in terms of post-disaster futures, is that I feel like these post-disaster futures are probably going to be more equitable futures, more inclusive futures, more diverse futures. There's been so many movements around Black identity in Puerto Rico, LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ movements, gender justice. A feminist organizing in Puerto Rico has been driving a lot of the changes in the past few years. So the way in which we're imagining the kind of post-apocalypse, post-pandemic, post-everything, I think might also transcend, the limits on our imagination imposed by patriarchy and heteronormativity and homophobia. And so it's been really interesting to me to see how all of those have been kind of packaged together in recent struggles. So that's where I find hope, even as my family is sitting in the dark, in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, what you're saying is reminding me of the words of Arundhati Roy, who said that the pandemic is a portal, and traditionally pandemics have been these portals into, I guess, different lived experiences.
And
so
can I just say, like, I feel like in the U.S. there was this moment where COVID, and the pandemic and the response, it seemed like it was opening up new possibilities, but somehow we were rushed into this like return to normality. I love memes, and because part of what memes help us access is those emerging imaginaries. There was a meme of a Venn diagram of like, oh, this is where we're at now, like pandemic and back to work. Like somehow we're trying to manage those two realities, and I feel like the portal that was opened up by COVID might have been closed in some ways, or we'll see what it reveals itself as in the future. But I think that in Puerto Rico, because it wasn't just one disaster, but these repetitive disasters, that has really forced the imagination in a different way, because it's been kind of constant opening up of portals,
Almost too many. We're actually out of time, but I do not want to leave without answering at least the one question that we got in our Q&A.
Fernando,
yes.
I'll leave the Q&A. There's some other questions that popped up.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I couldn't see. I could only see one.
There's one in the chat, and then there are two in the Q&A right now. But I'll be reading out the questions for you all.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Hobson. I'm program coordinator for the Drescher Center for Humanities, and I help to run the Humanities Forum. So I'm going to read your questions. Please remember, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, or if you're unable to access that, you can also type it into the chat. The first question is from John Knight. They ask, would statehood end the Jones Law?
I assume he means the Jones Act that regulates commerce in Puerto Rico. I actually don't know if it would end it. I think what's interesting about the Jones Act, I don't know if you know if it would end it, Fernando, but you know, the U.S. Virgin Islands, it has gotten out of the Jones Act. So the Jones Act, part of what it implies is that any goods that arrive in Puerto Rico have to be on U.S. ships, personed by union workers. And so there are ways in which that's good and you know, benefits a lot of workers. And I certainly believe in fair labor practices, but in places like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, I don't know what the situation is in Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, Alaska, etc. This can be a real hardship. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it deters intra-Caribbean trade, which would be really important for us. So, Fernando, do you know if the statehood would eliminate that automatically, or if it would have to be negotiated?
Well, I think there's often some confusion around the Jones Act, because there's the Jones Act, that is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, but then there's also the Jones-Chapter Act, which is the one that gave Puerto Rico its current structured Senate. It established a Bill of Rights, and it established the resident commissioner, among other sort of tax exemptions. So it would definitely supersede the Jones-Stafford Act in the same way in which that act superseded the Foraker Act. So Puerto Rico would come to be, if we were a state, would come to be governed on the U.S. Constitution. So yes, the answer to that is yes.
What about the other Jones Act?
But the other Jones Act, that is a contention that can continue in spite of statehood. In fact, Puerto Rico joins other territories in wanting to get out of the Merchant Marine Act, but they've had issues because the labor movement in the United States is very, very supportive of the Merchant Marine Act, because they unionize those workers who receive labor protections through the Merchant Marine Act. So I think that we're at a place where there haven't been the conversations that there need to be between progressives in Puerto Rico and the labor movement that would join struggles in the sense of preserving those labor protections in a new arrangement, all the while freeing Puerto Rico of these really burdensome regulations of having to bring everything through the Merchant Marine. So, which makes everything in Puerto Rico and all territories much more expensive. It drives up the cost of living. But there's definitely a division there with the labor movement in the United States, and I know that it was not very well received in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, when folks in Puerto Rico were asking for repeal of this act. That a lot of well-known labor unions actually published a page long ad defending the Merchant Marine Act. So that created some divisions. Something interesting in terms of what could drive progress in Puerto Rico. Courtney, should we take at least one more question? I know we're 5 minutes over.
Well, no, you have 15 minutes for Q&A, so
Okay,
that's
cool.
that's up in addition to 5 o'clock. So our second question is from Wangui Gangas. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. They ask, where is the intersection between community self-sufficiency, autonomy, and the duty of the state?
I think that's, relates to what we were talking about before. Yeah, like where is the intersection, and where is it not the intersection? Like, what is entirely state responsibility versus community responsibility? To me, things like the electric grid, when you have people in housing, in condominiums, when you have people in public housing, when you have folks who can't afford electric panels, to me, that is something that has to be guaranteed by the state. Because, I mean, also we live in a society where cell phones are somehow guaranteed by the state. Like if you can't afford a phone, you can get and they call it the Obama phone. But and yet electricity is not guaranteed, you know. So we do. I think there needs to be a kind of basic set of rights, and in other places there is the idea that there should be a guaranteed income. You know, so that is something that as a society we have to decide, but there definitely has to be a certain set of human rights, you know, that we have to be guaranteed, such as clean air, drinking water, and now electricity, and some would argue internet. I think particularly with the pandemic, where we've been forced to be all virtual, and folks who are sent home to you know, to receive education, which is something that we've also decided is the responsibility of the state to provide. Having the ability to connect to this remote education has become a necessary human right.
Okay, we have another question that came in from Camille Maddox Winfield. She says, thank you so much, Yarimar, so happy that you're here. I'm thinking about how the pandemic has further highlighted debates around autonomy and public health in the non-independent societies of the Caribbean. In what ways would you say the COVID-19 crisis adds complexity to your very important interventions to how we understand sovereignty and non-sovereignty from the time of your research in Guadeloupe to the present moment in these non-sovereign sites? I'm thinking about local responses on these islands to and refusals of public health mandates and other decisions being made by the state, by those larger governing bodies overseas.
Well, I have an essay coming out in a book edited by Deborah Thomas and Joe Maskell about I forget the title of the book because it changed several times, but the book is about sovereignty. And a version of it came out already in public books titled, I think, COVID Deja Vu or Pandemic Deja Vu. There I talk about how I think there was this really interesting moment early on in the pandemic where precisely kind of sovereignty came into question. In Puerto Rico, some of the debates were about whether we could close our airport, whether we could, you know, kind of control our borders or not. And there was this fascinating moment where, again, the mayors, Fernando, I don't know if you remember this, some of the mayors began trying to close their borders within towns in Puerto Rico, and they couldn't do that, you know. But so this debate, and Puerto Rico couldn't close its border because of our airspace is controlled by the U.S. and it's, you know, it's been pretty proven that our biggest problem with COVID has been that airport and its connection to the U.S. Even as, you know, international travel has been blocked in lots of parts of the world. I think that became a really interesting contention. And then within the U.S., I think the nature of the U.S. as a federation of sovereign states kind of really came into relief during the pandemic, when it was impossible to issue national mandates. And so, and the reasons why state sovereignty has long been protected, you know, have long been associated with discriminatory policies, etc. But in the pandemic, it did provide some reprieve for some states to be able to make some decisions and institute some local mandates where the federal state was not stepping in, you know. But you know, now it's kind of shifted a bit, where at the federal level there is a desire to impose some mandates around vaccination and masking and some public health mandates that are just the national state is just not able to do, because so much of it is relegated to state sovereignty. So I think that you know, thinking about sovereignty beyond the nation state has been really interesting in the moment of COVID, both in terms of a kind of larger, thinking about a kind of larger global phenomena that requires the coordination of states. You know, this moment has shown how we're interconnected, and a virus could not be contained. As we were told in Puerto Rico at first, we were like, oh, there's a virus in China, we don't have direct flights to China, we're fine, you know. So that, you know, that kind of was revealed, but also the importance of kind of lower level political units that I've become more interested in recent years. States within the 50 states, municipalities, townships, etc., and the ways in which they can at times exercise a sovereignty that the national state cannot. became really interesting to me during this time. And it's something that I hope that we don't forget, you know, because so much happened so quickly that it can be easy to forget. The governor of California declared that California was a nation state at one point. I have a screenshot. And so there was this moment of when there seemed to be a kind of state sovereignty being put into play, and that is still now being debated.
All right, I think that's it in terms of questions. I think we can wrap it up. Thanks again to Fernando and Yarimar for such a great conversation. This will be available online as soon as possible. We just need to get the captioning lined up, but I hope everyone has a good rest of your evening. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a true
Thank you.
pleasure to be in conversation with you, Fernando.
No, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for your time.